The warning came on a quiet Sunday morning. Mark was standing by the kitchen counter pouring coffee while I scrolled through a message on my phone. He didn't sound angry or suspicious when he spoke. In fact, his voice was calm enough that I almost ignored what he said. "Does that guy from your office message you this often?" I remember looking up and smiling like the question was harmless. "It's just work," I told him. Mark nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. At the time, I thought he was simply reading too much into something small. Now, when I think back on that moment, I realize it was the first time my husband tried to warn me about something I couldn't see yet. Mark and I had been married for 21 years. By the time this happened, we were both in our late 40s, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where not much changed from one week to the next. Our 2 children were already away at college, which meant the house felt calmer than it had in decades. Our marriage wasn't dramatic or exciting, but it was stable. We had built a life together through patience, routine, and mutual respect. That's why it took me so long to understand what Mark had noticed. The colleague he mentioned was a man named Brian. Brian had joined our company about 6 months earlier. He worked in the same department as I did, and from the beginning he was friendly in a way that made it easy to talk to him. He had a quick sense of humor and a way of making stressful workdays feel lighter. At first, our conversations were strictly about work, but gradually they became more casual. Sometimes Brian would stop by my desk just to chat for a few minutes. Other times we would end up talking during lunch breaks with a few coworkers. None of it felt unusual to me. Offices are social places and friendships naturally develop over time. Mark, however, started noticing small things that I didn't. It began with the messages. Brian occasionally texted me about projects after work hours. At first, those conversations were brief and practical, but over time the messages started including jokes, small personal comments, and questions that had nothing to do with the office. I didn't think much of it. To me, it felt like the normal kind of communication that happens when coworkers collaborate closely. One evening, Mark glanced at my phone while we were sitting in the living room. "Still talking to that colleague of yours?" he asked calmly. "Yes," I replied. "We're finishing a report for Monday." Mark nodded but said nothing more. A few days later, he brought it up again during dinner. "I'm not saying anything inappropriate is happening," he said carefully, "but that guy seems to reach out to you a lot." I laughed it off. "Mark, he's just friendly," I said. "You're overthinking it." Mark didn't argue with me. That was something I always respected about him. He never forced his opinions into arguments. Instead, he simply expressed his concern and allowed me to make my own decisions. Looking back now, that calm patience made his warning even more important. But at the time, I dismissed it completely. A few weeks later, our company organized a team dinner at a local restaurant after finishing a major project. Spouses were invited, so I asked Mark if he wanted to join me. He agreed without hesitation. The restaurant was lively that evening. Colleagues were laughing, sharing drinks, and celebrating the success of the project we had worked on for months. That was the first time Mark met Brian in person. Brian greeted us enthusiastically and immediately started a conversation with Mark about sports and travel. He was charismatic and confident, the kind of person who easily fills a room with energy. To most people, he probably seemed completely harmless. But I noticed something in Mark's reaction. He was polite the entire evening, but he became unusually quiet whenever Brian joined our table. He listened more than he spoke, observing the conversation in a way that suggested he was paying close attention to something subtle. When we left the restaurant later that night, Mark drove in silence for several minutes before finally speaking. "There's something about that guy," he said calmly. I sighed a little because I already knew where the conversation was heading. "What now?" I asked. "He seems very interested in you," Mark said. I shook my head. "He's interested in being friendly with everyone," I replied. Mark glanced at me briefly before looking back at the road. "Maybe," he said. And that was the end of the conversation. For the next couple of months, life continued as usual. Brian and I continued working together on several projects, which meant we spent a lot of time communicating throughout the week. Our conversations remained light and friendly, and I still believed there was nothing unusual about the situation. But small details began appearing that I couldn't completely ignore. Brian started asking more personal questions about my life outside work. He wanted to know about my hobbies, my weekend plans, and sometimes even my marriage. At first, the questions seemed casual, but gradually they started feeling more direct. One afternoon, he asked something that caught me off guard. "So what does your husband think about you working late with me all the time?" he said with a slight smile. I laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about Mark's warnings again. Still, I convinced myself that everything was fine. The moment that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Most of the office had already left for the day, and I was finishing some paperwork at my desk. Brian walked over and asked if I had a minute to talk about something privately. We stepped into a small conference room. Brian closed the door behind us and leaned against the table, looking slightly nervous. For a moment he didn't speak, as if he was deciding whether or not to continue. Then he finally said something that made my stomach tighten. "I know you're married," he began carefully, "but I feel like there's something between us." The words were simple, but they carried a meaning that instantly changed how I saw the past 6 months. In that moment, every conversation, every message, every joke suddenly looked different in my memory. I realized that what I had considered harmless friendliness had been interpreted very differently by him. I told him calmly that he was mistaken. "I'm happily married," I said firmly, "and I've never intended to give you the wrong impression." Brian looked disappointed but didn't argue. He simply nodded and said he understood. The conversation ended quickly, but the weight of it followed me all the way home. When I walked through the front door that evening, Mark was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The familiar smell of food and the quiet comfort of our home felt different that night. I placed my bag on the counter and looked at him for a moment before speaking. "You were right about something," I said quietly. Mark turned toward me with a calm expression. "What happened?" he asked. I told him everything. The conversation in the conference room, Brian's confession, and the realization that I had ignored the subtle signs Mark had been trying to point out. Mark listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he simply nodded. "I wasn't trying to accuse you of anything," he said gently. "I just noticed things that made me uneasy." I asked him how he had seen it so clearly when I couldn't. Mark thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes when you care about someone," he said, "you pay attention to the small things they're too close to notice." His words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. The next day at work, I made sure my interactions with Brian remained strictly professional. The friendly conversations stopped, the personal messages ended, and the distance between us became clear. Within a few weeks, the situation faded away completely. At home, Mark and I returned to our usual rhythm of quiet evenings and simple conversations. Nothing dramatic had happened, but something important had changed inside me. I began listening more carefully to the instincts of the man who had spent more than 2 decades by my side. Because marriage isn't only about love or loyalty. It's also about respecting the perspective of the person who knows you better than anyone else in the world. And sometimes the warnings that seem unnecessary in the moment are the ones that matter most. I didn't take my husband seriously about my colleague. And now I understand that he wasn't trying to control anything. He was simply protecting the life we had spent 20 years building together.